Hey everyone, hope you're all in a good mood today because I've got a new story for you. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really means a lot to me. $412. That's what was sitting in the account we'd been feeding since the winter the pipes froze at my old place. The account that was supposed to have a little over $18,000 in it. The account I drove to the credit union to move money out of because the venue balance was due, and Cade kept forgetting to do the transfer. I stood at that window in the branch off the highway with my card in my hand, and the woman behind the glass turned her monitor a little. Not toward me exactly. More like she was double-checking that she was reading her own screen right. And she asked if I wanted a printout. I said yes. She printed it. I sat in my Kia in that lot for probably 40 minutes with the ack blowing hot air at me, because the ack in that car has been broken since before I met him, reading a piece of paper I already understood the first time. Okay, backing up, because I know none of that means anything to you yet. We're in Dubuque. Not the pretty part on the bluff. The flat part down by the river where everything smells like the water in July. Cade we lived, in half of a duplex his Aunt Camilla owns. She owns both halves. She charges him almost nothing because he's her sister's kid and because she's been in a cold war with his mom Frances since before I existed, something about their own mother's house and who got the dining set. And Camilla being generous with Cade is one of the ways she wins that war. I say this because it matters later. Everything in that family is a move against somebody else. The other half of the duplex is Theo, who is my friend Christina's brother, which is actually how Cade and I met in the first place, at Christina's thing after her divorce got finalized. Theo can hear everything through that wall. Everything. We knew that. We'd made jokes about it. So the money. We opened it together at the credit union, both names, and the deal was we each put in what we could every 2 weeks. I put in more. I know I put in more because I picked up extra shifts all last fall and winter, and every single one of those went straight in there. Cade put in when he had it, and didn't when he didn't. And I let that go because, in my head, I was being the person who understood that his money was seasonal and mine was steady. Here's the part where you're all going to be mad at me. In February, he asked me to pause the automatic transfer on his side just for a couple months. He and Toby had been going to the auctions down in Davenport, buying cars, fixing what needed fixing, flipping them. It started as a thing they did on weekends, and then it became the entire personality. Cade would come back from those auctions lit up like a kid, telling me about some Altima he got for nothing, telling me that his brother Mason is 34 and still doing the same thing he did at 22, and that Mason will retire with a decent chair and a plaque and Cade is going to have something. That was the word he used constantly. Something. Frances praises Mason at every family gathering. Steady, reliable. Mason bought his mother a washer and dryer. Mason. And Cade would sit there with his jaw doing that thing and then drive home and talk for 40 minutes about how by next spring nobody would be talking about Mason. I paused the transfer. I told myself it was 2 months and I was being supportive and that's what you do. He never turned it back on and I didn't push. Because in April Camilla threw him this whole thing for his birthday at her place, put out actual food and made a toast about how one of them in that family finally had guts. And Frances sat there with her mouth in a line. And Cade looked at me across that table like we'd won something together. When someone lets you into their war like that, you stop asking questions about the money. I found out at the credit union on a Saturday morning in June. The venue balance was due the following Friday. Our date was the first Saturday in October. I did not go home and cry into a pillow. I drove to the duplex, and he was in the driveway washing a silver Altima with a rear panel that doesn't match the rest of the car. And I got out with the printout and asked him where $18,000 went. And I need you to understand he did not even do the thing where they look surprised. He kept the hose running. He asked me why I went to the credit union without telling him first, like that was the topic, like I'd broken into something. I said, it's my account. It's my name. I'm allowed to walk into a building. He said this is exactly what he was talking about. And I said talking about with who? And he shut that off and started in on how I go behind his back and how it's insane that I'd rather ambush him in his own driveway than have a conversation like an adult. I followed him inside. He went to the bedroom, and I went to the bedroom. He went to the kitchen, and I went to the kitchen. I was not letting him get to a room I wasn't in. 30 minutes of him refusing to say a number. He finally gave me pieces, and the pieces came out over about 2 hours and they kept changing. First it was he moved some of it. Then it was he had to clear something up with Camilla before the thing at her place because she'd started making comments. Then it was the 2 cars he and Toby went in on at the end of May, which he had absolutely told me about, which he had not told me about. He told me they were looking at cars. Looking is a different word than buying. And he stood in that kitchen and argued with me about the definition of the word looking. Roughly 6,000 and change back to Camilla for what she'd floated him for the first car. About 4 to close out a loan he'd had since before me, that I knew existed and did not know the size of. The rest into the auction. All of it in 1 week in May while I was picking up Sunday shifts to make the venue payment. I asked him what he thought was going to happen in October. I asked him if he thought I was going to walk into a room with 110 people in it and the venue unpaid. And he told me I have no vision. He said everybody in my family has no vision. That my dad has driven the same car for 11 years and calls that responsibility. That I would be happy in a duplex forever eating the same dinner every Thursday. And that he can't build a life with somebody who panics. Then he picked the printout up off the counter where I'd put it and threw it at me. Not near me. At me. It hit my collarbone and went on the floor, and he told me I'm too useless to build a future with, and that at least he's brave enough to risk everything. Theo heard the whole thing through the wall. He told Christina that night. Christina called me before I was even out of the parking lot at my parents' place. I went to my mom and dad's in Dyersville that night and stayed 9 days. My dad is Albert, and my dad has never in his life raised his voice at me, and my dad wanted to drive to Dubuque at 10:40 at night. My mom, Sandy, stood in the doorway of the garage and told him he was not doing that. And they had a fight about it in front of me. An actual fight. My mom saying he'd make it about himself, and my dad saying somebody should make it about something. My dad had given us $3,000 toward the venue deposit in the spring. He handed it over at their kitchen table and told Cade to take care of his kid. So on top of everything else, I got to sit there and watch my father do math about his own money in his head and pretend he wasn't. I spent that entire 9 days managing my parents instead of managing my own situation. And I'm still not over that. My sister, Becky. Meanwhile, Becky is due in November. Becky has been fighting with Brad about his mother since Easter. And Becky's contribution to my crisis was to tell me she'd already paid a deposit on a sitter for October, and to ask when she was getting that back. She also brought up the $1,200 I lent her in the fall. Unprompted. Which she does every time anything financial happens in this family because she cannot stand owing anybody. So that's a whole separate war I'm now fighting in the middle of this one. I called Cade probably 20 times over those 9 days. I'm not going to pretend I went silent and dignified. We talked for hours. He'd start calm and end up screaming that I humiliated him by telling my parents. He said he was going to pay it back by August. He said Toby had a guy in Cedar Rapids for the Ultima. He said if I'd just believed in him one time in my life. Every single conversation ended with him being the one who was wronged. Then the second Wednesday, Francis called me. Not to check on me. Francis called me to tell me that Cade had called the venue and canceled. That it was done. That the deposit was gone, because we were inside the window, and that she thought it was for the best, because clearly I wasn't ready. My dad's $3,000. Canceled by a man who did not use $1 of his own to put it there. He canceled our wedding and did not tell me. I found out from his mother. And then he started talking. By that weekend, it was everywhere in his circle that I'd walked out on him over money, that I bailed the second things got tight, that he took a risk, and I couldn't handle a man who takes risks. Toby's girlfriend, Allison, who is furious at Toby for his own reasons. Because Toby put in on those cars too, and they'd been saving for a house. Allison told Christina at the pool that Cade had been telling people I'd been looking for a reason to leave since spring. Jasper unfollowed me. Camilla's son, Peter, left a comment under my sister's post that I'm still thinking about. The last week of June, there was a thing at Francis's house. I went. I know. Everybody told me not to go. I went because I wasn't going to let them tell that story in a room I wasn't standing in. And because Camilla was going to be there and Camilla had questions about her $6,000 that nobody had answered yet. Cade was on the back patio holding a beer telling his cousin about a Chevy he's got a line on. He saw me and did this thing where he raised his eyebrows like I was a delivery he wasn't expecting. Francis told me it was nice of me to come. Mason wouldn't look at me at all. And I didn't say anything. I didn't scream, I didn't throw a plate, I didn't tell 20 people what he actually said to me in that kitchen. I got a plate of food, and I sat down next to Camilla. And I smiled at him across that yard for 2 hours. Because here's the thing nobody in that family knows, and he forgot I know. He told me things in that duplex over years that he has never told his mother, has never told Toby, has never told Camilla, especially not Camilla, and he told me exactly what he thinks of every single person who was standing in that yard. I started that night. It's been about 6 weeks. I'm not going to lay out what I did yet because some of it is still moving and I don't want to jinx it, but I'll say this. By the second week of August, Toby was texting me. Then Jasper. Then Francis, who has never once texted me anything but a picture of a casserole, asking me to stop. I haven't stopped. Anyway, I don't really know what I'm asking you guys. Half my family thinks I should have let it go in June, and the other half is mad I didn't do more, and my mom keeps saying I'm going to regret this. And I keep telling her I'm not going to regret anything. I'll put up what happened when I can. It's a lot, and I'm still in the middle of it. I need to yell this. Cade is not some fearless visionary. He is a reckless man who wanted applause for gambling with money he didn't earn. The second he said, "Why did you go to the credit union without telling me?" I wanted to scream at the screen. Because it was her money too, you absolute clown. And you have no vision? Sir, your vision was secretly draining the wedding fund while worked extra shifts to cover your responsibilities. Then he called her too useless to build a future with after throwing the statement at her. I genuinely hate how perfectly he weaponized her support against her. Sitting at that party with a plate of food and a smile while knowing every secret about those people is the coldest thing in this entire story. Now Toby, Jasper, and even Francis are crawling into her messages because the version Cade sold them is finally cracking. He wanted to be admired as the bold one. Instead, he exposed himself as a liar with a fragile ego and a hose in his hand. Update. Okay, so first, to whoever commented that I sound like I'm building up to something and asked if I was going to leave everybody hanging. Yes, I was. Sorry about that. Some of it genuinely wasn't finished yet, and I didn't want to type it out and jinx it. It's finished enough now. And a bunch of you asked what I meant when I said he told me things he never told his family. So I'm going to answer that. But not all of it in one go. Because one piece is still doing damage and I'm not touching it until it lands. So that night at Francis's house, the one where I sat next to Camilla with a plate of taco dip in my lap for 2 hours, I did not bring up money one single time. And that was the hardest thing I have done in my entire adult life. Because she wanted to talk about her knee and about Francis buying the wrong buns for the burgers, and I let her. I sat there and I nodded about buns while the man who threw a piece of paper at my chest stood 20 feet away with a beer. And at the end of it, she patted my arm and told me it was a shame what happened, and that I was welcome at her place anytime. She said that in June. I want everyone to remember she said that in June, because it matters, and I'm going to feel bad about it later. What I did do that night was listen to him. He was on the patio telling his cousin about a Chevy Traverse he was picking up in Anamosa. And then 20 minutes later, he was telling Mason he'd have the flip money back by Labor Day. And then right before people started leaving, I heard him tell Toby that Camilla wasn't in a rush, and Camilla never asks twice. That's the sentence I drove home with. Because it isn't true, it has never been true. Camilla has been asking that family for money and favors and apologies for 40 years. She just doesn't ask him. Because he's her project. Because handing Cade things is how she stays ahead of Francis. And somewhere in 5 years, he'd confused being her favorite with being untouchable. And I knew something about that she didn't. Okay, so I have to explain the duplex properly because a lot of you commented assuming he rents from her like a normal adult person with a lease and a landlord. He doesn't. He pays her $400 a month for half a duplex that would go for $1,100 or $1,200 easy in that part of town. There is no lease. There was never a lease. And when he moved in 5 years ago, she told Francis she was doing it because somebody in this family should get a start in life. And Francis didn't speak to her for a year over it. And that's the entire reason the arrangement exists in the first place. It was never about Cade. It was about Camilla winning something. And Cade's version of that arrangement, the version he gave me in bed and in the car and at my parents' table at Thanksgiving and probably 400 times over 5 years, was that Camilla's a lonely old woman who needs to feel important. And he lets her feel important. He called it managing her. He'd hang up the phone with her and roll his eyes and tell me she'd talked for 40 minutes about absolutely nothing, and that $400 a month buys a lot of patience. And he said things about her house, about how she keeps it, about the way it smells in there. And he told me she was leaving both halves to him and Peter. And that Peter's an idiot who'd sell his share to him for nothing. He said all of that to me in a kitchen with the TV on, laughing, like it was funny, like I was his safe place to put it. Peter, by the way, is the one who left that comment under my sister's post about how some people find out what they're made of when things get hard. Peter is 38, lives in Waterloo, has a kid who needs braces, and has been quietly furious for about a decade that his mother rents half a building to his cousin for $400 a month. I didn't have to be clever about any of this. I want to be honest with you guys. I didn't do anything except stop protecting a man I wasn't married to, and had no reason on earth to keep protecting. The 4th of July was at Camilla's. It's the standing thing. She does ribs on the smoker Peter bought her and then complains all day that nobody appreciates the smoker. And I got invited because she invited me in June and never uninvited me. And Camilla does not take an invitation back once she's given it. Because that would be admitting Francis was right about something. Cade was there, obviously. He came up to me by the coolers and asked what I thought I was doing, and I said eating ribs. And he told me that showing up at his family's holiday was a psycho move. And I told him it's Camilla's holiday at Camilla's house, and last I checked he doesn't own that either. He walked off. Then he came back. Then he walked off and came back again. He could not leave it alone. He could not physically stand there and let me eat. And the second time he came back, he told me he'd been trying to protect me by keeping things quiet. That if people knew the real reason, it would look worse for me than for him. And I asked what the real reason was, and he wouldn't say it out loud in the yard. So I made him say it in the yard. I raised my voice and I asked him in front of Peter and Peter's wife and 2 cousins and Mason what the real reason was. And he did the laugh. The "we're not doing this here" laugh. And I told him we absolutely are doing it here. Because he's been doing it everywhere else for 3 straight weeks, and I'm the only one who hasn't gotten to hear it. And he cracked a little. Not all the way. He never goes all the way. He said I'd gotten cold feet in the spring and used the money as an excuse. That I'd told him in March I wasn't sure. Which is a lie. I never said that. Not in March. Not ever. And everybody standing there watched me hear it. And I told him fine. If I said that in March, then give me the date. Tell me where we were standing. Tell me what I was wearing. And he said I'm not doing this. And then Mason, who wouldn't even look at me at Francis's the week before. Boring, steady Mason, who bought his mother a washer and dryer and gets his name said at every family table. Said out loud. Not even to me, to his brother. Just tell them what you did with it. That's when Camilla came off the porch. And I need to be really clear here, because I know somebody's going to say I ambushed a 71-year-old woman at her own barbecue. I didn't tell her anything. He told her. She asked him what Mason meant, and he tried to give her some version about consolidating a few things. And she told him she got her $6,000 back in May, and she'd assumed his business was doing well. And he said it was. And she asked him whose $6,000 that was. And he looked at me. He stood in his aunt's yard and looked at me for help after what he said in that kitchen. And I ate a rib and looked right back at him. So he told her it came out of the account. Our account. He said it like it was a technicality. Like a filing detail. And she asked him if he'd used a girl's wedding money to pay her back, and when he started in on the long explanation, she told him she didn't want the long version. And then she went inside and did not come back out. Not for the fireworks. Not for anything. Peter walked her in and sat with her on her own porch for the rest of the night, and I don't know what they talked about, but I can make a pretty good guess. Because that man has been waiting 10 years for his mother to ask him a question like that. Then I did nothing for 11 days. On purpose. 11 days of absolutely nothing while my mom told me I was becoming somebody she didn't recognize. Because I wanted him to think it was over. And he called me constantly in those 11 days, and I answered. Every time. I want that clear because a bunch of you keep assuming I went no contact and got all silent and dignified about it. No. I talked to him for hours. And he'd start almost normal, asking how I was, telling me he had a buyer for the Traverse, and that once it cleared he was putting $8,000 back in the account as a good faith thing. And then around the 50-minute mark it always turned. It turned every single time. Into how I embarrassed him in front of his family. And how his aunt hasn't answered his calls since the 4th. And how I did that to him on purpose. I told him I didn't say a word to her. That he said it, in his own voice, in front of everybody. And he told me that's the most manipulative thing about me, that I set things up so I never have to be the one holding the knife. He also said the wedding was never the point for me, that what I actually wanted was a party where my dad could cry and everybody could finally see me get one thing right. And that's the kind of thing 5 years of knowing somebody buys you. He knows exactly where I'm soft and he goes there. And I let him say all of it every single call, because every call he told me a little more about where he was sleeping. And who was still letting him in the door. Which is how I knew that by the middle of July he was on Toby's couch. Not because Camilla threw him out. She didn't. She just stopped speaking to him. And he can't function in a building where the woman who owns it won't return his calls. He told me himself he'd rather be at Toby's than sit over there feeling like a tenant. And that sentence tells you everything about how he'd been thinking about that duplex for 5 years. And Allison is where this stopped being only about me. She's been with Toby 6 years. They'd been saving for a house since last summer. They had an actual number and they were going to hit it in the fall. And Toby put in on those auction cars in May, same as Cade did, except Toby put in more than he told her, and she found that out herself at the end of June. And they have been fighting about it ever since. Christina hears all of it, because Allison's stepsister is in her Thursday thing. So Allison already hated the whole car situation. And now the guy who talked her boyfriend into it is asleep in her living room eating her food. I did not call her. I'm never going to call her. The second 2 women in a situation like this start comparing notes, it turns into a completely different story and everybody stops taking either one of us seriously. And I'm not handing him that. What I did was drive out to the lot off the county road on a Saturday in the third week of July, because I knew Toby'd be there, and I knew Cade was in Anamosa. Toby's a decent guy who's in way over his head, and he tried to be nice to me. He said he was sorry about everything and asked if I was okay. And I said I'm great, Toby. And then I asked if he knew Cade told Camilla that 6,000 was flip profit. He didn't know that. And then I asked him if he knew what Cade said about him. Because he did say things, for years, about Toby needing him. About Toby being the one who does what he's told. About how Allison runs Toby's whole life and Toby's fine with it, because Toby has never made a decision by himself. And how Toby would still be detailing cars in his mom's driveway without him. I didn't give him all of it. I gave him the driveway one. And I stood in a gravel lot and watched a 31-year-old man holding a bottle of tire shine do the math on 6 years of friendship. He texted me that night saying he wasn't getting in the middle of it and asking me to leave him out. And then 2 days later, he texted again asking whether Cade ever said anything about Allison. Which, he did. Obviously, he did. And I still haven't answered that one. Then Jasper, who unfollowed me in June and then texted me on the 28th of July out of nowhere saying he heard I've been going around talking, and that everybody's got problems and I should let the guy breathe. I sent back 4 sentences. 4 true things Cade has said about Jasper's wife over the years. And Jasper hasn't answered me since, and I know for a fact he hasn't stood next to him at anything since either. Then Frances, who called me in June to tell me my wedding was canceled like she was reading off a weather app, texted me on the 9th of August asking if we could talk. And when I called her, she spent 11 minutes explaining that Camilla has told Cade he needs to be out by October, and that Peter's been at his mother's every single weekend, and that this is going to split the family for good and that I need to understand what I've started. And then she asked me to stop. I asked her stop what? Exactly. Stop eating ribs. Stop answering her son's phone calls. Because I have not done one thing that wasn't true, and I have not said one word he didn't say first. And she told me I know what I'm doing. And I told her, yeah, I do. Here's what I haven't told you guys yet, and it's the reason those 11 days in July weren't me being classy. I was waiting on something. There's a thing he wants very badly that's happening at the end of this month. Something he's been building towards since spring and telling that entire family about since spring. And I've known since June that I could take it away from him. I could have done it in June. I didn't. Because in June it would have cost him one bad weekend, and by the end of August it costs him every single thing he's been bragging about since March. My mom keeps telling me I'm going to look back and hate myself for waiting on purpose, and I keep telling her that waiting on purpose is the only part of this I'm actually proud of. And my dad hasn't said one word about any of it, which somehow feels worse. I'll update when it's done, because it's not done. I need to yell about Cade saying she sets things up so she never has to be the one holding the knife. Sir, you spent weeks lying to everyone, walked straight into your own confession, and then blamed her for not stopping you. He is so committed to making her the villain that even his own words become her fault. The Camilla scene made me furious. He looked at Op for help after using her money to repay Camilla. The nerve of expecting the woman he called useless to rescue him in front of his aunt. I also understand why she gave Toby one comment instead of the entire file. She wasn't trying to become the family gossip hotline. She wanted Cade to lose control of the story. Frances begging her to stop after helping spread his lies is rich. Op is doing this on purpose, and I'm not going to pretend it's noble, but after everything he did, I completely understand why she stopped protecting him. Final update. So the thing he'd been building towards since spring. The thing I could have blown up in June and sat on until the last week of August. Camilla was selling the duplex. Both halves. She'd been talking about it since February because of her knee and the stairs and wanting one of those one-floor places out toward Asbury, and Cade had it fixed in his head that he was buying it off her. Not at market, at the family number, and he told me in March in the car coming back from the auction that she'd basically said she'd rather it stay in the family than deal with a realtor, and he'd been telling that version to everybody ever since. Toby knew. Mason knew. He told his cousins at the 4th standing right there, with a beer in his hand. That's what the flipping money was actually for. That's the something he kept saying. He was going to walk into that family owning the building his mother's sister owned with Peter, shut completely out of it. And Frances would never get to say Mason's name at a table again as long as she lived. And Camilla had never once actually said yes to him. She said we'll see. Which is what she says about everything from the weather to whether she wants a second helping. And he heard a signed contract. The paperwork side of it was moving in late August because that's when the place in Asbury opened up. And that's the date. That's the whole reason I sat there for 11 days in July with my mouth shut while my mother told me I was turning into somebody hard. And what I actually did is so much smaller than what half of you were imagining in the comments. I promise. I didn't need a plan. I needed Peter. He's been driving in from Waterloo every weekend since the 4th. The man has watched his mother hand his cousin a 5-year discount on an entire building while he treats an oil change appointment like a financial event. And I went over there on the second Saturday in August with the lemon bars she likes from the place on Central and sat at that kitchen table with the two of them for 3 hours. I didn't pitch her anything. Peter did it himself about halfway through, because he'd already been chewing on it for weeks. And he asked his mother straight out why she was in such a hurry to hand Kate a discount, when Kate had just paid her back with the girl's wedding money. And she got right back on defending him the way she's been defending him for 5 years. Said he'd had a rough go of it. Said Francis never gave that kid anything and somebody had to. So I told her the rest. Not the money. She already had the money part. I told her what he said about her house, about the way she keeps it, about the smell of it, about the 40-minute phone calls. I told her he called it managing her. I gave her the $400 a month buys a lot of patience line word for word exactly how he said it in my kitchen with the TV on. And I told her he said Peter was an idiot who'd sell his half for nothing. She asked me if I was making it up because I was hurt, which is a completely fair question, and I told her so. And I said if I were making it up, I'd have made up something better than a comment about how her house smells. And I gave her the date and what we'd been doing that night. And I told her Theo heard everything through that wall for 5 years if she wanted to ask somebody who has no dog in this. She got up and started wiping down a counter that was already clean, and said she stopped speaking to her own sister for a year over that boy. And then she kept wiping it. And Peter looked at me across the table and neither of us said anything. The listing went up 2 weeks later with a realtor and a sign in the yard. Peter drove her to the appointment, and Cade found out about it from Mason, which I think bothered him more than the sale did. Then the last week of August happened, and I need to tell you all of it because it's not clean. He came to my parents' house in Dyersville on the 24th, a Sunday afternoon. And my dad answered the door and did not raise his voice at all. He said his piece about the $3,000 for the venue right there on the step, and then he stepped back and let him in. Because my mother was already saying, let him talk. Let her hear it out loud in front of us. 4 hours at that kitchen table. I'm not exaggerating for the post. It was 4 hours. My mom made coffee twice. He started with sorry. He'd been out of his mind in June. The auction stuff got away from him. He was scared and he took it out on me. The useless thing was something he said in a moment, and he doesn't think that, and never did. And he'd been calling for 6 weeks because he wanted to fix it, and I let him call knowing exactly what I was doing the entire time. And then he got to the actual reason he drove out there, which was that he wanted me to call Camilla and tell her I'd exaggerated. That was it. That's what 4 hours was for. I'd say I was hurt and I'd blown a few things out of proportion, and the sale could still get pulled, and he'd have the money back in the account by Christmas, and we'd be normal by spring. He had a whole timeline for it. He'd clearly been driving around with that timeline in his head for days. I asked him if he understood that I hadn't lied to her, that every single thing I told that woman came out of his own mouth first, in his own house, in his own voice, and he said the thing that ended it for me completely, which was that saying something in your own house to your own girlfriend isn't the same thing as it being true. That's his entire position. He is not sorry he said it. He's sorry I repeated it. And we went in circles on that for probably another hour, because I would not let it go. I asked him 4 different ways whether he thought his aunt deserved to know what he thought of her, and he never answered it once. He kept sliding off onto how she's 71 and I used her, and how Toby won't ride out to the auctions with him anymore, and Toby was the only person who ever had his back, and I took that too. And then he said the thing he'd clearly been saving, that I waited on purpose. And I said yes. Out loud at my mother's table with my father standing in the doorway, yes. I waited. I knew in June, and I sat on it until the week it would cost him the building, because in June it would have cost him 1 bad weekend and a phone call. And I wanted it to land somewhere he'd actually feel it. And I'd do it again tomorrow, and if he wanted an apology, he should have thought about that before he threw a piece of paper at my chest in his kitchen over money that was half mine. And that's when my mother spoke. And this is the part I actually want to tell you guys about, because so many of you have been asking about her since the first post, since she said I'd regret it, since I said we weren't okay. We had it out the week before he showed up, a real one, in her garage with the door open and the neighbor's dog going off, where she told me I was becoming somebody hard, and I told her that her whole life is about wanting everyone to behave themselves, that she talked my dad down in June, and then spent 2 months managing me the same way, and she cried and I did not take one word of it back. And then she sat in her own kitchen for 4 hours and listened to him. That's what did it. Not me. Him. 4 hours of him talking. And her hearing that the only reason he came was to get me to lie to a 71-year-old woman so he could still buy a building. She told him he needed to leave. She said it once sitting down, and then she stood up and said it again. And when he started in on how she of all people should understand what it's like to have a daughter who. She did not let him finish that sentence. She told him she'd been wrong about him for 5 years and she was finished being polite about it. That she fed him at that table at Christmas and Easter, and she watched him talk over her husband. And that if he ever genuinely wanted to know why her daughter waited until August, he could sit in his truck and think about what he threw at her in June. He left around 8. In the driveway, he told me I'd made myself into somebody nobody's going to want, and that he can rebuild and I'm just going to be this now. And then he texted me at 11:40 that same night asking if I'd think about calling Camilla. Now Becky. Because I left her in a bad place in the last post. She didn't speak to me for 11 days after what I said at my mom's about her running a spreadsheet in her head since we were kids. And what ended it was not either of us apologizing, because neither of us did and neither of us ever will. It was her deposit. She put $150 down on a sitter back in the spring so she could be at my wedding in October 6 weeks after her due date. And when he canceled that venue, the sitter kept the $150 because that's the policy. And Becky ate that. And Becky does not eat money. Ever. Not once in her entire life. She showed up at my apartment on a Thursday 8 months pregnant, sat down on my couch, said she'd been thinking about it and she was mad at the wrong person. And then she went after him for 45 straight minutes, in a way I have honestly never heard from her. She brought up Christmas 2 years ago when he made that comment about Brad's job. She brought up him showing up an hour and a half late to her baby thing in May, and then eating like 4 plates. She had a list. She'd been keeping a list the whole time and I never knew. She still wants her $1,200 back. She brought that up in the same conversation without blinking. And that's just who she is, and I've genuinely stopped taking it personally. Then she made me go through the whole duplex thing twice. Every detail. And when I got to Peter driving Camilla to the realtor, she put both hands on her stomach and said good. She's due in 6 weeks, and I'm going to be at that hospital. Camilla hasn't called me, and I don't think she's going to. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend that isn't what it is. She invited me over in June when I had nobody, and I used her kitchen table to take something away from a man. But Peter texted me the week the sign went up in the yard. Just a photo of it, and nothing else. No words at all, and I've looked at that picture more times than I want to admit to strangers on the internet. And Frances called me on the 30th and spent 10 minutes telling me I'd done something to a family that was already hanging by a thread. And then she said, and I could hear her deciding whether to say it, that she's known for years that her son talks about people, that he does it about her too, to her face. In the version where it's supposed to be a joke and you're supposed to laugh. She and Camilla are speaking for the first time in 5 years. Not because of me exactly, because they finally sat down and compared what he'd been saying about each of them to the other one. He didn't lose everything, in case that's the ending anybody was hoping for. He's got the Traverse and whatever's left of the auction stuff and he'll land somewhere. He always does. He's still telling people I walked out over money. Christina heard it from Theo, who heard it through that wall before he moved out, obviously. And that story is never going away and I've stopped caring about it. But he's out of the duplex at the end of September and the family number is gone and that building is going to a complete stranger. And he's out of Toby's the same week because Allison gave Toby a date, which had nothing to do with me and everything to do with her having spent since June fighting him about that money and then finding the guy who talked him into it asleep on her couch. Toby told him, and he called and told me like it was something I personally did to him. Some of it I did do, though. Toby and Jasper both know what he said about them because I'm the one who told them and I'm not going to dress that up as some noble truth-telling thing. I told them because I wanted him to walk into a room and find nobody in it. The account had $412 in it when I found out and I closed it. And my dad only took his share after I told him I'd keep offering until he did. And he started calling me on his way home from work now. Doesn't really say much. Just checks in and complains about traffic for a minute. And hangs up. I don't have a wedding to plan and I'm not fine and I'm not going to pretend I am. But he stood in my mother's kitchen and asked me to lie to an old woman for him and my mother threw him out of her house. And my sister is sitting in her 3rd trimester keeping a list of everything he's ever done. And he does not know yet where he's sleeping in October. He said he was brave enough to risk everything, and he just never once considered that I might be too. I'm completely on her side. Cade drove to her parents' house, sat through 4 hours of I'm sorry. And the actual goal was still call Camilla and tell her you exaggerated. I would have laughed in his face. He didn't want to repair anything. He wanted Op to lie so he could keep buying the duplex with money he stole from their future. And something said in your own house isn't the same thing as it being true is the dumbest excuse I've heard in this entire story. He knows it was true. He just thought Op was his private storage unit for every nasty opinion he had about people. I'm also glad Op admitted she waited specifically to hurt him. She finally stopped protecting him, and I honestly love that her mom heard him for 4 hours and went, "Okay, get out." That was the first useful thing anybody in this family did. Oh, anyway, that's the story. Love you guys. See you in the next one.